Hello everyone, we're going to start with this starter today before we move on to our topic 4. So I'd like you to read the following and try to figure out what word goes in this space. So if you stop the video for a second. Okay, so when an egg becomes fertilized, it is called a zygote. After the first cell division there are 2 cells, and after the 4th division the number of cells is 16. Okay, because you go to 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, and then 8 to 16 every time it doubles. Each of these cells has the potential to give rise to any type of cell and is therefore said to be totipotent. Okay, the type of stem cell that can become any cell, including itself. After approximately 5 days, a mass of cells forms called a blastocyst. Scientists can extract stem cells from the blastocyst, which are said to be pluripotent, as they can give rise to most cells but not the extra embryonic cells like the placenta. Okay, I think we've done this before in a lesson, but I thought we'd just check again whether you're still okay with those words. But the topic for today is biodiversity and classification. I think you've already started this topic with Kirsty, as in topic 4, on the wild side. But this is the first lesson you have on biodiversity and classification. So today we'll be looking at defining species, habitat, biodiversity and endemism. We'll be explaining the principles of classification. We'll be explaining the phylogenetic classification system. And finally we'll be looking at describing the process by which a scientific community critically evaluates and approves new ideas. So the first thing I'd like you to think about is, how do we know a species? How do we know that something is a separate species from something else? Okay, you might have ideas of, well, they look very different, or they behave very different, or they live in very different areas. But the actual definition for this, and usually I would get you to just find these definitions in a book, but I know you might not all have them. A species, and all of these key terms are very important, species is a group of organisms with similar characteristics able to reproduce to give fertile offspring. This line is the most important here. They can give fertile offspring. Okay, and I'll give you an example. Let's say we have a beagle and a pug. When those breed, they make a puggle. And then let's say we've got couple more pugs having a pug. If we try to breed the beagle and the pug, they can still have a child. They can have offspring, and the offspring is fertile. So what we've got here is 2 sets of parents with 2 offspring, so the puggle and the pug. We can see that they are fertile because you can breed them together to get another dog, basically. So that proves to us that beagles and pugs are the same species. They're able to produce fertile offspring if you breed them together. Okay, so all dogs are the same species. But if we use another example and we take a horse and a donkey, you can breed them together to get a mule, but mule cannot have a child. Okay, a mule is infertile, and so you can say that horses and donkeys are not the same species because the child they make cannot have offspring. And it's a similar idea of if you've seen like tigers and lions breeding together to get a tigon or a liger. Those should be infertile because tigers and lions are not the same species. So they have different numbers of chromosomes, and so their offspring basically cannot breed. Okay, the next key term is habitat, and that's the place where an organism normally lives. It's characterized by physical conditions and the types of other organisms present. And that's a pretty simple one. I suppose the most simple way of thinking about this definition is just where an organism lives. So if we've got our 3 bears here, for example, the habitats for each of them are very, very different. Even though they may look quite similar, even though they're all bears, all of them have a different habitat. For biodiversity, it's the range and variety of species, and biodiversity links very closely with genetic diversity as well. And genetic diversity is the number of different alleles in a gene pool. So when you have a population of, let's say, cheetahs with loads of different alleles for loads of different genes, that's a highly genetically diverse population. But then if 2 of those individuals migrate away and start a new population, because they only have so many alleles, they're going to start off a new population that's going to be quite limited. So it's low genetic diversity, and that can be quite dangerous, but we'll look at that in another lesson. Okay, so biodiversity altogether is the range and variety of species and the genetic diversity, which is the number of different alleles in a gene pool. Scientists estimate that there's about 8.7 million species on the planet, but actually there's probably way more, because there's a lot that we still don't know. And if you look at the breakdown of the different species, more than half of the identified species that we know of are insects, which you tend to not really think about. Then we've got plants, quite a big chunk, animals, quite a big chunk, but yeah, insects are the most common group there. And then we've got endemism, which is again a really important key term, because they can ask you that as a definition for an exam. Endemism is being restricted to a particular region and not found anywhere else on the planet. Okay, so those species must be quite rare because they only live in one area, one geographical area, and you cannot find them anywhere else. Now, interestingly, if you, in the exam situation, say that it's species being restricted to a particular habitat, you don't get a mark, because you can have the same habitat in different types of places. Like you can have a deciduous forest in many different places on the planet. Okay, being endemic means you're in a particular geographical region. Okay, we know that the world's biodiversity is not distributed evenly, and that there are actually hotspots, which are regions with significant levels of biodiversity that are threatened with destruction. There are species that are endemic, they are only found in that one location and nowhere else on Earth. And this is an image that shows you where the biggest hotspots are. So this is areas that have the biggest numbers of endemic species. So species that are only found in that one area and then nowhere else. And it tends to be things like islands, you can see some here, but also quite a lot around the equator, where the hotter temperatures are. So we have this Mediterranean basin in the south of Europe, which is a hotspot because there's a lot of species there that you only found in that Mediterranean basin and nowhere else. Okay, so let's have a look at how we name a species. In the past, scientists used to just describe organisms by how they looked. An example of that is a blackbird. But that comes into some problems when you have people speaking different languages. And examples like this. When I show you this, the mountain chicken, that probably makes you think that it's a chicken on a mountain, but it's not. It's actually a type of a toad. So things go a little bit crazy with naming, and so it makes sense to have a different naming system. So this guy, called Linnaeus, came up with the binomial classification system in the 1750s, and the word binomial just means two names. And you'll be used to that because you would have heard some of these Latin names in your own lives anyway, but I'll give you an example in a minute. Okay. Now, because of this binomial classification, and because of all the characteristics that organisms have, we can try to place them in a group. Okay, and that's taxonomy, the kind of study of classification of organisms based on their characteristics. Now, the characteristics are very different. It could be the observable characteristics. You know, if something has wings, you can put it in one group. If it has legs, you can put it in a different group. It could be behavioral similarities. It could be that if the animal has a same type of courtship behavior, you can put them in a similar group. Or it could be something called molecular phylogeny, which is probably the most advanced. And what that means is analysis of genetic material to establish evolutionary relationships between organisms. And is, I suppose, the most scientifically accurate, because you're not just assuming that if something looks similar, is the same. For example, you could argue that the koala bear and the grizzly bear are closely related because they're both called a bear and they both sleep a lot, but actually one's a mammal, the grizzly bear's a bear, whereas the koala bear is actually a marsupial, so it's actually more closely related to a kangaroo. Okay, so you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you've analyzed their DNA. Okay, so here's a wolf, and a few words around the world that are used to call a wolf, and you can see how easily it can get confusing. So in scientific communities, it makes sense to just give it one binomial name. Okay, so there's always two words. Remember the binomial. And those words, really importantly, stand for genus and the species. Okay, so the first word is the genus and the second word is the species. When you write those words down, if you are typing, they should be italicized. So see how I've italicized it here. But if you're handwriting, then you underline to show that it's a scientific name. The genus is always capitalized, but the species is always lowercase. Okay, and what that means is that we have a genus that contains quite a lot of different species. So this one is a wolf, Canis lupus, and there's only one Canis lupus in the world, or one species, but Canis familiaris is a dog, just a normal dog that you have at home. So they both belong to the same genus, the Canis, but they are different species. So this is Canis lupus and a normal dog is a Canis familiaris. So I would like you to have a look at whether you can remember that, and out of these tell me, or just think to yourself I suppose, which one of these is the correct way of writing Tyrannosaurus rex, and then think about what is the binomial classification name for humans. Okay, so stop the video. Okay, so if we go through it one by one, the genus is capital and the species is low, which makes sense. However, this has been typed and it's not been italicized, so we would say that this must not be it. Here we've got big T for genus, little r for species, and it's italicized. Could be that one, but let's just check. Here we've already seen that there's a capital for a species. That's incorrect. Here we're missing a capital for the genus name, incorrect. And here we've got 0 capitals, so it must be B here. And then for the binomial classification of humans, hopefully you would have written down Homo sapiens. Big letter H for the Homo, small for sapiens, and should be underlined if you have written it out, or italicized if you are typing. Okay, so covering that, we have covered 2 taxa. You would have heard this word already, perhaps at GCSE, but you can call it taxon if it's one. You call it taxa if there's more than one. So we now know about the genus and the species. Just to let you know, the word genus is the singular word, so one genus, but when it's more than one, it's said to be genera. Okay, so 2 genera, 3 genera. Now there's 8 taxa, so multiple taxons, overall that you need to know about. We know about genus and species. Species being the most specialized, genus being one where you could have different species within it, and you can kind of see how it's represented here by the different dots. But there is actually a lot more. So we've got domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And you do have to memorize that. I've heard of some students learning a song at GCSE. You may know that. It may be that you probably only covered it up to kingdom, but we also need to know about the domain. The way that it's easy to memorize, or at least the order: delicious king, prawn, curry, or fat greasy sausage. That's how I remember it. I've also heard dear King Philip came over for good soup. You can use either, as long as you remember what it actually stands for. So you need to know the words domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. You would not be expected to know examples. I will give you an example, but you would not necessarily have to just recall a random kingdom or a random class. Okay? So if we're sticking with the idea of the wolf belongs to the domain Eukarya, which I will talk about later in the lesson as well. The kingdom is animals, so Animalia. Phylum is Chordata, which basically means chordates, or animals with a backbone. Class is Mammalia, mammal. Order is carnivores. Family is dog-like. Genus is Canis, so all the dogs. And then separate species. So, to check all that knowledge, what I would like you to do is complete the following exam question, which you can find on Moodle if you want to type it up. So the question is, Table 1 shows how a bird called bluethroat is classified by biologists. Complete Table 1 by filling in the 5 blank spaces with the correct terms. And actually, I've made a mistake here. I've said this is 2 marks. It's only going to be 2 marks. It's only going to be 1 mark, sorry, because there's a bit here that I've missed out. but the name of the bird is Lucinius vesica. That should have been filled in for you. So the 1 mark comes from filling in this table. So if you stop the video here and try to figure this out without looking at your notes. Okay, so we've got the domain, and then you just have to remember the order. So we've got kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and then the genus and the species was done for you. Okay, so if you've got all of those correct and in the right order, you do get that 1 mark. And then the second part of the question is, another population of birds with similar morphology, and morphology is the way something looks, was found nearby. Describe how breeding experiments could determine whether the 2 populations are the same species. Okay, now the answer is breed the 2 types of birds together. That's 1 mark. Breed the 2 suspected species together, and if they produce the same offspring, or if they produce fertile offspring, then you can say that they are a species. Okay, so 1 mark for saying breed the 2 birds together, see if they produce fertile offspring is the 2nd mark. Now, as I mentioned earlier, classification can get quite difficult. For example, if you look at this bird, the willow tit and also the marsh tit, you can see that they look very, very similar, and you can see how people would maybe classify them as the same species. So this is where that DNA analysis that I've mentioned earlier could come in really handy. So I'm going to show you in a minute how we can compare different species DNA, but again, DNA analysis by itself doesn't tell us whether 2 individuals can reproduce to produce fertile offspring. So, you know, we can see a number of differences in the DNA, but unless we breed them together, we won't truly know if they're the same species, or if they're different species, because there's always going to be DNA differences between any organism anyway. So let's say we've got these 3 sections of DNA, with the section A being original, so they've got this thymine, cytosine, guanine, adenine, and so on and so forth. And the question is, compare the sequences to organism A. Which are the closest related? So we're just basically going to compare B to A and then C to A. So here we're going through and seeing already the DNA for organism B has an adenine there, and that disagrees, so we're just going to highlight any differences. Okay, and then we do the same for C. So the first 2 are fine, but then the third is a cytosine when it should be a guanine. Here it's all fine, but this thymine is different, and then this thymine is different. So if we count the amount of differences, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 between A and B, whereas between A and C it's only 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you can say that organisms A and C are more closely related than A and B because their DNA sequences are more similar. Okay, now all of that DNA work can be used to actually show evolutionary relationships between organisms, and the word phylogenetics means just that, the study of evolutionary relationships between organisms that shows common ancestors and shows the relatedness of species. Okay, now we've got an example here. This at the beginning would be basically, well, time is kind of on the vertical axis here. So this is a very long time ago, and then this is more recent, more recent, more recent. So you can see that the divergence of mouse to man happened not that long ago compared to man and frog, for example. That happened way longer ago. Now, whenever you see the splitting here, that means that there was a common ancestor there. Okay, so between human and mouse, the common ancestor was a certain time ago, but the common ancestor between human and a lizard was even further away, even longer ago. Okay, the common ancestor to this fish and humans and everything else was even longer ago as well. Now, just to remind you what evolution is like and how phylogenetics works, people sometimes think that evolution is basically fish eventually evolving to become a salamander, eventually becoming a cat, and eventually evolving to become a human. That was definitely an idea in a couple 100 years ago. But what it's actually like is similar to your family tree. Your great-grandfather doesn't become your grandfather, which doesn't become your father, and that doesn't become you. Evolution works the same way. You will have shared common ancestors For example, you and your siblings have the shared common ancestor of your parents. You and your cousins have a shared common ancestor in your grandparents. And it's the same in evolution. Humans and other mammals have some kind of common ancestor that's a mammal, but then mammals and amphibians have a common ancestor that was a four-legged vertebrate. That was the most recent organism that shared those characteristics. Okay, so that's how it works. Now, there's a couple of terms you need to know about phylogenetics. You already know species, so if you think to yourself, do I already know that definition? If you stop the video, could you define it? Okay, so it's the group of similar organisms that are able to produce fertile offspring. Anytime we've got a split, that means that there's a common ancestor. So we see here that there's a common ancestor between human and chimps, and then a common ancestor between gorillas, humans, and chimps further away. So from this tree, you can see that we are more closely related to chimps than we are to gorillas, because we had a common ancestor less kind of, I can't remember the actual years, but let's say this is 50 million years ago, and this is 100 million years ago. Now, there's a key term here as well, clade. A clade is a group of organisms comprising all the descendants of a common ancestor. Okay, so because we've got this box drawn around this common ancestor and every descendant, you can say that that's a clade. But I'll show you more examples here. For example, we've got a box here that has this common ancestor. Remember, that's just a split in the tree, and the ends of the tree represent species. And because it's the common ancestor plus all the descendants, that's a clade. Here we've got a box drawn in a different way, and it's including this species here. So that's not a clade, because the common ancestor of these two branches is here, and that ancestor is not even included. Here we're not including this one species, so that cannot be a clade, because the clade is all of the descendants of a particular common ancestor. But here again, that is a clade, because we've got a common ancestor here, and all of the species eventually helped to evolve. Okay, so that is a clade. And a good way of looking at it is by looking at mammals. So a chimp and a bear obviously will have some kind of common mammal ancestor. All of those three will have a common amniote ancestor, so that means just amniotic fluid, whether that's in an egg or in a uterus. Common tetrapod ancestor, so a four-legged. For the sunfish and the chimps, the most recent common ancestor was some kind of jawed vertebrate, so some kind of animal with a backbone with a jaw. Whereas the most recent common ancestor for a lamprey and a chimpanzee and everything else was just a backbone ancestor. We don't always exactly know who the ancestor was, because maybe there's not fossils for it that's been found, but knowing how evolution works has helped us assume that this is what's happening. Okay, so another exam question for us. There are over 200 species of catfish. All catfish evolved from a common ancestor. The diagram shows how some of the species of catfish are classified. This diagram is based on the evolutionary links between the species. Okay, so the phylogenetic tree is similar to how we've seen it, except this time it's just facing the other way. So we've got the common ancestor here and all of the descendants. Which species of catfish is most closely related to Pseudontis membranacea, which is this one here? So put in your answer for that. Which of the species of catfish is most distantly related to Pseudontis membranacea? So which of all of these has diverged a really, really long time ago? And then finally, how many genera or how many genuses are shown in this diagram? Okay, so we'll go through the answers. So the species of catfish most closely related to Pseudontis membranacea is the Pseudontis batensoda. Okay, you can see that they've got quite a recent common ancestor. The split is quite close. Which species is the most distantly related? Well, it must be this Mochochus niloticus, okay, because you can see that their common ancestor was a really long time ago. And then finally, how many genera are there? Well, we need to count how many genuses there are. So that's one, that's another one, that's another one, that's another one, and these are all the same. So they belong to the same genus. So there's 5 different genera here. Now, I mentioned the word domain when we looked at the taxa, the taxonomic words. There are 3 domains in the world. So you would have heard of bacteria before, you would have heard of eukaryotes before, so that's your animals, fungi, plants. But then there's the third group called the archaea. Okay, and this is actually a relatively recent addition to the domains, because it used to be thought that the archaea were just bacteria. So we used to just have bacteria and the eukaryotes. But when you look at their phylogenetic tree, you can actually see that the bacteria and the eukaryotes did at some point, millions years ago, share a common ancestor. But actually archaea and eukaryotes shared a common ancestor even more recently. So eukaryotes, like us, are more closely related to archaea than they are to bacteria. And the man who made all of this happen is called Carl Woese. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his surname, so forgive me. But we're going to go through how he not came up with this idea, but how the idea got approved. And that's our last learning objective, is how does information kind of get approved by the scientific community. And so what he did is he was looking into evolutionary relationships in prokaryotes in the 1960s. And he looked at one group of bacteria that seemed to be lacking some of the genetic sequences that all the other bacteria had. And so in 1977, he proposed that those bacteria are a completely different domain, a completely different branch of life, and he called them the archaea. And so he thought there's the archaea, the bacteria, and the eukaryotes. He published his work, as all scientists do. Now, when you publish your work, when you send it to a scientific article, it doesn't just get published straight away. It gets sent to at least 3 experts in the field for peer review. Okay, so the scientific community peer reviews, and that's a key term, and actually they rejected and ignored his findings. They thought he was wrong. Okay, so they didn't really approve of his theory at all. But then a really influential microbiologist at the time, called Otto Kandler, accepted his work and thought, yeah, that makes sense, and actually published supporting findings. So he did similar genetic experiments and found the same thing. And because he was quite famous and agreed, the theory ended up gaining more and more acceptance, and so a new system of classification was proposed in the end. Now, you don't necessarily have to remember all of the names of like Otto Kandler, but Carl Woese's name does get brought up in some exam questions, and you definitely need to know about peer review and then repeating the experiments by other scientists to publish findings before something is accepted. So I'll show you it here. So the question could be, discuss the process by which the scientific community critically evaluates new theories. Okay, so the first step is, the theory is communicated to the scientific community. Like Carl Woese did, he submitted it to a scientific journal. The second mark is peer review. Okay, so experts in the field trying to figure out whether they think the methodology is good, whether the scientist has the right idea. And then finally, the checking evidence to ensure validity. For example, repeating the experiment to check findings, like Otto Kandler did and found the same exact thing. And that brings us to a final exam question. So in the 1970s, a theory for a new system of taxonomy was proposed by a scientist called Woese. The new system of taxonomy identified 3 domains, J, K, and L. The table gives some of the characteristics of those 3 domains. Okay, and you're going to have to figure out which domain is which. So we're going to look at the characteristics first of all. A true nucleus. These 2 have it absent, but L has it present. Now, out of archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes, which of those have a true, real nucleus? And the answer is, of course, eukaryotes. So we already think, oh, L must be eukaryotes. But let's just check. Mitochondria. J and K don't have them, but L does. Okay, this is a membrane-bound organelle. That gives us even more evidence that this may be eukaryotes. Ribosome size, we've got 70S, 70, and 80S. At this point, we can be pretty sure that this is eukaryotes. So we now just need to figure out which one of these is bacteria and which one of these is archaea. And so far, they've been the same. So we'll go to the next bit. Sensitive to antibiotics. J is sensitive, K is not. Now, when you take antibiotics, it is always for a bacterial infection or a bacterial disease. Okay, so that says to us that J must be bacteria and K must be the archaea. But let's have a look at the further characteristics, because actually you may be asked in an exam question to describe the differences between bacteria and archaea, and these two are quite important. Okay, so bacteria have a cell wall which contains peptidoglycan. Okay, it's essentially a mixture of protein, because peptido, and glycan, which is a carbohydrate. Okay, archaea do not have that. Plants in the eukaryotes obviously have cell walls, but those are made of cellulose, not of peptidoglycan. And the final difference is that archaea and eukaryotes have lipids in their cell membranes that contain ester bonds. So you will remember this when we add our glycerol to our fatty acids, that's an ester bond. In bacteria, it's not an ester bond. It's a different name that we don't need to worry about. Okay, but those three things lead us to this conclusion, is that the answer is B. Bacteria must be J, archaea must be K, and L must be eukaryotes. And then we've got this question: describe how molecular phylogeny can be used to determine the similarities and differences between three domains. Okay, so if you can't remember, you might want to flip back to that slide where I talked about molecular phylogeny. Okay, and the answer is, we can be looking at the sequences of bases in DNA or RNA. This is what we did, okay? Anything in the squiggly brackets has to be included in the answer. We could also be looking at sequences of amino acids in proteins, because DNA is transcribed and translated to make proteins, so you could look at that as well. We know from the table that we could look at the structure of the cell membrane or the cell wall, because there's differences, and we could also look at the size of ribosomes. Okay, molecular phylogeny is looking at evolutionary relationships using molecules. So DNA, proteins, molecules in cell walls, or ribosomes. Any of those would do. Okay, so hopefully you've marked along with me in the lesson. What I would like you to do is make sure that you are submitting evidence of having completed these questions, but also marking yourself. Quite a few people have been sending me work that's not been marked, and I need you to be aware of where all of the marks are available. But as a final check, I would like you to complete this table. There's a lot of key terms I've mentioned in this lesson, and I know it can feel a bit overwhelming because it's a new topic. So without looking back at the lesson, I need you to check whether you understand what those terms are. Can you define it without looking back? Because in the exam, you're not going to have any notes to look at. Okay, I know for classification we've mentioned things like kingdom, phylum, and whatever. I only really want you to define what a domain is. And I know that there's bacteria, eukaryotes, but I want you to try to describe as much as you can about archaea, because that's the new thing for you. Okay, so I would like you to fill in the definitions as well as you can just by your memory. And then if you are struggling and need to look back either on the internet or on this lesson, add anything that you were missing in a different color, please, so that I know what came from your own memory and what you had to add afterwards. Okay, and then you can send me that whole document on Moodle by 4:30 today. If you've got any emails or any questions, just email me. Thank you.